Picture this. You're dropped into this incredibly vibrant city, ancient palaces right next to, super modern skyscrapers.
Mm,
The air smells like amazing street food, but there's also this buzz of high-tech energy.
that's Seoul, all right. South Korea's capital.
Exactly. It's famous globally, isn't it, for that mix of old and new. Places like Gyeongbokgung Palace, Myeongdong's shopping streets, the whole Hongdae vibe.
Definitely a top destination.
There.
Which leads us to why we're here.
Right. One of you listening, thinking about a trip, actually sent us a whole bunch of sources, articles, some research papers, even forum discussions.
All asking that key question. If I'm visiting Seoul, how safe is it, really?
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going through all this material you sent.
Yep, trying to piece together the reality on the ground for visitors. What should you actually be aware of?
Okay, let's jump right in. The first thing, and it's loud and clear across everything we looked at.
Is that Seoul is considered very, very safe.
Incredibly safe, yeah. The sources kept saying that South Korea and Seoul in particular just ranks really well compared to, say, major Western cities or cities elsewhere.
Totally. We saw the numbers, too. Like, Seoul's Numio Safety Index is up at 75.77.
Just high.
And the crime index is low, 24.23. And the sources consistently described violent crime as, well, extremely rare for visitors to encounter.
What really hit home for me, though, were the personal stories. Those forum threads.
Oh, yeah.
People saying they genuinely felt safer wandering around Seoul than back home, and they were coming from places like Delhi, Canada, the U.S.
That's telling.
Feeling okay leaving a laptop for a second in a cafe or walking alone late at night. That perception, that feeling of safety, it seemed really strong in the material.
It definitely paints a picture of feeling secure for most visitors.
Yeah.
But the sources also dug into why that might be, what actually contributes to this.
Well, it seems like a few things working together. First off, just a low baseline crime rate compared to a lot of other big industrialized countries.
Right, although one source did point out that while it's low globally, it has technically increased a bit since the late 70s. Still low, but a slight upward trend noted there.
Interesting. Then there's the visible presence of police and military, too. Some sources tied that back to the history of the truce after the Korean War.
Suggesting it acts as a kind of deterrent, maybe against more organized crime, both local and international.
And you can see the government invests heavily in security. That was mentioned, a real focus on resources for safety.
Yeah, and tied into that is the cultural aspect. The sources mention an emphasis on, respect and social order.
Which probably helps keep public spaces calmer.
Definitely. And then there's the shame and CCTV factor, as one guide put it.
The cameras, yes.
Yeah.
Multiple sources said cameras are just everywhere.
Like, unavoidable.
And it's not just for catching people after something happens, but the idea is the likelihood of being caught and the public shame that comes with it is a huge deterrent before anything happens.
Exactly. Plus, there are other layers of preparedness people notice.
Yeah.
Well, travelers mentioning seeing emergency gear just readily available. AEDs, protective equipment in subway stations.
Oh, right.
Even stuff in hotel rooms like emergency hammers, rappel lines, flashlights. It's a level of public safety prep that seems quite noticeable to visitors.
It adds to that overall feeling of, okay, things are taken care of here.
Yeah.
And maybe slightly different, but the sources also mentioned South Korea ranks high for things like water quality and general cleanliness.
Yeah, Environmental Performance Index.
Yeah.
It contributes to that sense of an orderly, well-managed city, which probably feeds into the feeling of safety, too.
So the big picture for visitors seems overwhelmingly positive on safety. But like any city, it's not perfect. The sources did highlight specific risks, the kind of things visitors are actually more likely to run into.
Right, and consistently what came up wasn't violent crime, but non-violent stuff. Petty theft, pickpocketing?
The usual suspects for tourist areas.
Exactly, and they pinpointed where this is more of a risk. Crowded places.
Makes sense.
Busy markets, like Myeongdong or Namdaemun. Festivals, packed subway cars during rush hour. Basically, standard big city awareness is what's advised.
Did they mention scams?
Yep. Especially things like being overcharged for products in those really tourist-heavy market areas, like Insadong or Dongdaemun.
So check the price first.
That was the advice. Confirm the price before you agree. And maybe be wary if someone's being super pushy or the deal seems too good to be true.
What about taxis? Sometimes you hear stories about drivers taking longer routes or something.
That was mentioned as a possibility, but the sources generally felt it's less common now. Meters are standard.
Okay.
And crucially for visitors, taxi apps are huge. They track the ride, the fare, much more transparent.
Right. Now, This is where things get a bit more nuanced, especially looking at those online discussions you sent. Nightlife safety, and specifically for women.
Yeah, the general advice is still caution in the big nightlife spots like Itaewon and Hongdae. Even in a safe city, those areas have their own dynamics.
And there was a bit of a split in the sources on one issue, right? Drink spiking.
There was. One source sort of downplayed it, said it was rare, but then in the forums you had several people calling it a big or known issue, especially in clubs and bars.
Hmm. So conflicting perspectives reported there. It's worth noting that difference.
Definitely. Other risks brought up in nightlife settings were things like groping in super crowded clubs,
Ugh.
and just general advice, good anywhere really, about being careful accepting drinks or food from strangers.
Okay, and this ties into the broader discussion in the sources about safety for women travelers, including solo travelers.
It does, and again, the baseline message was that Seoul is generally very safe for women. Streets are well lit, public transport runs late and feels secure.
They even mentioned specific things like women-only subway cars late at night.
Yeah, and female-only taxi services. Measures aimed at enhancing that feeling of security.
And this is where the traveler feedback, especially on Reddit, added a really important layer.
What kind of things came up?
Several women shared experiences of being stalked, harassed, or followed.
Okay, that's concerning.
And a big one that came up repeatedly in those threads was hidden cameras.
Right, the Molka issue.
Users were explicitly warning others about this, saying check bathrooms, hotels, Airbnbs, changing rooms. It was flagged as a known ongoing problem to be aware of.
That's a serious concern.
And there was also talk in those forums about some men maybe fetishizing foreign women. The phrase ride a white horse was mentioned. And accounts of behavior described as manipulative or forceful, particularly in social or dating situations involving alcohol.
Okay.
One comment from a user in the source material was really stark. They basically said the most dangerous men might not be strangers, but people you actually get to know, especially around drinking.
Wow.
And this person perceived a lack of legal protection for foreign women in those scenarios compared to Korean men.
It's crucial to stress these are points raised by individuals sharing experiences and perceptions in the sources, particularly online forums. Not necessarily official crime stats, but real concerns being voiced.
Absolutely. And the sources also lightly touched on feminism being a sensitive topic in Korea, something one user suggested being cautious about bringing up.
So given all that specific feedback within the source material, what precautions were recommended for women?
Pretty much common sense, but amplified. Watch your drink carefully, use a buddy system if you're out late, stay aware of your surroundings.
Especially in clubs or bars?
Right. Use official taxis or reliable apps with tracking. Be mindful walking home. And based on the sources, consider checking for hidden cameras in private spaces.
Okay. Shifting focus a bit, another safety concern that surfaced in the sources was about a recent perceived increase in certain types of violent crime.
Yeah, these crimes of abnormal motives, as the police apparently call them, attacks against strangers.
Still rare globally, but the sources indicated a noticeable uptick in South Korea recently.
And these incidents, like stabbings, have tended to happen in public places.
That's what was reported. Subway stations, shopping malls. One source cited police stats, over 900 such attacks, mostly assaults, in just the first half of 2023.
That sounds like a lot.
It does. And understandably, it's caused public concern within South Korea. A poll mentioned in one source showed over half of South Koreans felt very worried about random violence.
Were there mentions of copycats or online threats?
Yes, potential copycat incidents and online threats, some described as misogynistic, were noted in the context of these attacks.
But, and this seems really important for visitors, the sources stress these attacks don't seem to be ideological.
Right. Police attributions mentioned in the sources pointed towards things like mental health issues or sort of a general discontent with society.
And crucially, the sources didn't suggest foreigners were being specifically targeted in these incidents?
No, that wasn't indicated. So while the overall crime rate is still low, and this type of violence is still uncommon compared to many places, it's a recent trend that's increased local anxiety, and you might see a more visible police presence because of it.
Okay. Let's talk about actually getting around Seoul safely, because the sources were pretty positive about this for visitors.
Very positive, yeah. Public transport gets high marks across the board. Safe, efficient, reliable.
The subway system is huge, right?
Massive. And modern, clean. CCTV everywhere, emergency buttons in the cars. The main risk mentioned again was just pickpocketing if it's super crowded, like rush
The
hour.
buses.
Also seen as safe and easy for tourists. Big network, GPS tracking on them, regular maintenance, trained drivers. They even have designated night bus routes that are considered safe.
Good to know. What about taxis or ride shares?
The advice was clear. Use licensed taxis. Look for the yellow sign, check for the meter authority mark.
Or better yet, use an app.
Definitely the top recommendation from the sources. Kakait is the big local one. Uber also works in Seoul and Busan.
Why are apps better?
GPS tracking, fare estimates up front, driver and user feedback. It just adds layers of security and transparency, especially if there's a language barrier.
Makes sense. And for navigating generally, not just transport.
A key tip from the sources. While Google Maps works okay, Naver Maps is generally the go-to, more accurate app in Korea. For walking, driving, public transport schedules, everything.
Good practical tip. And walking itself. Safe.
Generally, yes. Seoul's seen as pretty pedestrian-friendly. Drivers tend to respect crosswalks.
Even at night.
Walking at night is usually fine, according to the sources. Just use basic common sense, stick to well-lit streets, avoid empty alleys, the same stuff you do anywhere.
Did the sources give any advice on where visitors should stay? Or areas to be maybe a bit more cautious?
They did. Several neighborhoods were highlighted as generally safe and popular choices for visitors.
Gangnam.
Gangnam, Icheon, Seodaemun, Myeongdong, Hongdae, and Sanong. Each has its own flavor, you know. Gangnam's upscale, Itaewon's international, Hongdae is young and arty, Insadong is traditional, all generally considered safe bets.
And areas requiring a bit more awareness.
A few were mentioned. Guizhou District, parts of Yongsan, especially late at night, near some bars, and Chanyangni, which is a big transit hub but can feel a bit grittier, higher chance of petty crime after dark, according to the sources.
So not necessarily dangerous, but just be a little more vigilant, especially at night, in those spots compared to the rest of the city.
Exactly. It's about relative caution.
Something really interesting highlighted in the sources was Seoul's approach using CPTID.
Crime prevention through environmental design. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Because it's not just reacting to crime, it's trying to design it out.
Yeah.
Changing the physical environment.
Right. The sources gave great examples, like creating safe houses in residential areas.
What are those?
Often marked spots, maybe with a yellow gate, cameras, emergency bells. Placed where residents felt there were blind spots or unsafe areas.
Clever.
And turning dark, sketchy alleys into lit-up fitness circuits with exercise gear, making people use the space, which makes it safer. The Saltway in Yeomidong was cited as a success story.
I read about using old phone booths or even convenience stores like 7-Eleven as designated safe points, too.
Yeah, adapting existing stuff, making safety visible and part of the city fabric.
It's not just top-down, right? The community is involved.
Hugely. The sources stress that. Getting residents involved, the eyes on the street idea, community watch groups, shared spaces. It's a collaboration.
Between residents, government, businesses.
Exactly. And the reports suggested it's working. Reducing crime rates, and maybe just as importantly, reducing the fear of crime in those targeted areas.
That's really innovative. Okay, beyond crime, what other essential safety stuff did the sources cover for visitors?
Emergency numbers are crucial. 112 for police,
Got it.
119 for fire and ambulance.
119, okay.
And there's a tourist hotline, plus 82-21330 that offers English help. Plus, various safety apps you can download.
What about the situation with North Korea? People always ask about that.
The sources addressed it. They basically said, look, technically it's a truce, not a peace treaty, but the situation's been generally peaceful for 70 years, despite occasional rhetoric.
And the DMZ tours?
Mentioned as a popular, safe tourist activity. The advice was just stay informed via reliable news, avoid any large political protests if they happen, and don't take photos of military stuff.
Makes sense. Any natural disaster risks mentioned?
Briefly, there's a rainy season, June to September, sometimes with typhoons. Could mean localized flooding or landslides. Low tsunami risk on coasts, so no evacuation routes if you're seaside.
What about air quality?
Pollution, especially yellow dust from China, can be an issue. Mainly March to May. Check daily reports, maybe pack masks. Very low malaria risk, but only right near the DMZ, not Seoul.
And travel insurance?
Strongly recommended by pretty much all sources. Always a good idea.
What about health stuff? Water?
Standard travel vaccinations advised. Tap water is technically safe, high standards, but many locals boil or filter it. For visitors, it's generally okay unless a sign says otherwise. Hotels often provide filtered water.
Okay. And finally, a quick list of things the sources said not to do or bring.
Big one. Drugs. Don't
Yeah.
buy, don't use.
Yeah.
Penalties are extremely severe.
Right.
Also, don't bring knives or pepper spray. They're generally illegal or need permits.
Drones.
Restricted in lots of public and sensitive areas. Best to check rules carefully if you plan to fly one. The sources also listed helpful apps beyond Naver, like Kakao, maybe some safety-specific ones.
And practical things like luggage storage services, specific travel insurance companies were mentioned too. Useful resources.
Definitely.
So let's wrap this up. We've gone through a lot of material about safety in Seoul for visitors.
And the overwhelming picture is of a city that is, both by stats and by visitor experience reported in these sources, incredibly safe.
Yeah, you've got solid infrastructure, visible security, these cool community projects like CP-TID.
But, as we saw, being informed means knowing the nuances.
Right. Remembering to be mindful of your belongings in crowded places.
Mm-hmm.
Using caution in nightlife districts. Sticking to official taxis or apps.
Knowing those emergency numbers, 112, 119. Basic, practical steps for any traveler, anywhere.
It does leave you with a thought, though. We see this high overall safety, tons of CCTV, very visible measures. Yet the sources, especially those personal accounts from travelers, highlight these less visible risks. Things that happen between people, maybe people you get to know, or specific concerns for women travelers like hidden cameras.
Yeah, it's a contrast.
So what does that tell us about the layers of safety in a city that's modern, changing fast? How do personal awareness and community watchfulness fit alongside the official stuff?
It's complex, isn't it? How much is perception versus reality? And how much relies on individual vigilance, even in the safest seeming places?
Exactly. It's an interesting question, something for you to maybe think about as you plan your own deep dive into exploring Seoul.